In July 1546, the screams of a woman pierced the stone walls of the Tower of London. Her body was being stretched on the rack, joint by joint, bone by bone, until her limbs tore from their sockets. She was the only woman in English history ever tortured by direct command of the king. But this wasn't just any woman. This was Anne Askew, and what she had done would shake the foundations of Henry VIII's throne. Here's what makes this story extraordinary. Henry VIII had broken from Rome. He had created the Protestant Church of England. He had executed Catholics who opposed him. Yet in 1546, he ordered the brutal torture and execution of a Protestant woman whose only crime was believing too deeply in the very faith he had established. Anne Askew would be dragged to her trial in a chair, her bones so shattered she couldn't walk. She would be carried to the stake paralyzed from the waist down. And even as the flames consumed her broken body, she refused to give Henry what he desperately wanted. Welcome to Throne of Lies, where we expose the savage truths that history's most powerful rulers tried to bury forever. You'll discover a story of courage so extraordinary, it terrified a king. You'll witness Anne's first confrontation with religious authorities that marked her for death. You'll hear the exact words she spoke in court that enraged her judges. You'll learn the shocking reason why Henry's own Lord Chancellor operated the torture device himself. And you'll discover the secret conspiracy that turned a young mother into England's most wanted heretic. But here's what will truly astound you. The most shocking part of Anne Askew's story isn't her death. It isn't even her torture. It's what she did that made the King of England so afraid. He was willing to break his own laws to silence her. That story begins in 1521, in the countryside of Lincolnshire, where a girl was born who would one day choose death over surrender. Anne Askew entered the world as Anne Askew, born into minor nobility in Lincolnshire. Her father, Sir William Askew, was a landowner who had embraced the religious reforms sweeping through England. This would prove crucial to everything that followed. In an age when most women could barely read, Anne received an education that would have impressed university scholars. She mastered Latin, studied theology, and most dangerously of all, she learned to read scripture for herself. Her tutors filled her mind with knowledge that would one day sign her death warrant. At 15, Anne's life took a devastating turn. Her father arranged her marriage to Thomas Kyme, a traditional Catholic who viewed women as property and the Pope as God's representative on earth, and found herself trapped in a union that violated everything she believed about faith and freedom. The marriage was a battlefield from the start. Thomas expected submission and demanded spiritual equality. When he ordered her to attend Catholic Mass, she refused. When he forbade her from reading Protestant texts, she read them in secret. Most shocking of all, she refused to take his surname. In a society where a woman's identity disappeared into her husband's, Anne Kyme insisted on being called Anne Askew. This wasn't just rebellion. This was a revolution. In 1534, when Anne was 13, Henry VIII had shattered the religious foundations of England. His break from Rome created chaos in every parish, every household, every marriage. Catholics clung to the old ways. Reformers embraced Protestant teachings. Most people simply tried to survive the confusion, but Anne saw opportunity where others saw chaos. She obtained her own copy of the Bible in English and began studying it word by word. What she discovered there changed everything. She found no mention of priests interceding between believers and God. She found no requirement for women to remain silent about matters of faith. She found, instead, a religion that spoke directly to individual conscience. Thomas Kyme watched his wife transform from an obedient child bride into a theological scholar. He watched her debate visiting priests and win. He watched local Catholics seek her out for religious discussions they couldn't have with their own clergy. He watched his authority crumble before a woman who believed God had given her the right to think. The confrontations escalated and began challenging the local Catholic clergy openly, quoting scripture to expose what she saw as their corruption. She questioned the authority of bishops. She mocked the sale of indulgences. She declared that any woman with a Bible could understand God's will without male interpretation. For Thomas Kyme, this was the final humiliation. His wife wasn't just defying him. She was defying everything English society believed about women, marriage, and religious authority. In 1544, Anne made a decision that would echo through history. She abandoned her husband and children, walking away from her life in Lincolnshire to seek something no woman had ever demanded before: a divorce on religious grounds. She arrived in London with nothing but her convictions and a brilliant mind that would soon capture the attention of the most dangerous people in England. Thomas Kyme had lost more than a wife. He had unleashed a force that would challenge the throne itself. Anne's courage to abandon everything for her beliefs was just the beginning. If you want to see how far she was willing to go, make sure you're subscribed to Throne of Lies. We're racing toward our first 1,000 subscribers and need your help to expose these buried stories that history tried to hide. London in 1544 was a city of secrets. In the shadows of Henry VIII court, Protestant reformers gathered in private homes, conducting illegal Bible studies and circulating forbidden texts. Anne Askew stepped into this underground world like a match thrown into gunpowder. Within weeks of her arrival, Anne had connected with the most influential Protestant circle in England, the household of Queen Catherine Parr. The king's sixth wife had surrounded herself with educated women who shared Anne's passion for reformed religion. They met in secret chambers, discussing theology with a freedom that would have meant death if discovered by the wrong people. Anne's reputation as a theological debater spread rapidly through these clandestine networks. She possessed something rare: the ability to quote scripture with the precision of a trained priest while speaking with the passion of a true believer. Her arguments were devastating, her knowledge unshakable, her courage absolute. She began writing. Her pamphlets circulated through London's Protestant underground, attacking Catholic doctrine with surgical precision. Each word was carefully chosen to expose what she saw as centuries of religious corruption. These weren't the gentle reforms Henry had implemented. These were radical challenges to the entire foundation of traditional Christianity. But Anne was playing a deadly game. Henry VIII had created the Protestant Church of England for political reasons, not theological ones. He wanted to be head of the church, not to transform its practices. Catholic rituals continued. Priests still claimed authority over scripture interpretation. The king had simply replaced the pope as the supreme religious authority. Anne Askew refused to accept this compromise. On March 13, 1545, the authorities struck. Anne was arrested and dragged before the judges at Guildhall, charged with heresy. The specific accusation cut to the heart of Catholic doctrine. She had denied transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine literally became the body and blood of Christ during Mass. What happened next stunned everyone in that courtroom. Instead of begging for mercy, Anne Askew launched into a legal defense that would have impressed the finest lawyers in England. She quoted Henry's own religious laws back at her accusers. She cited Protestant theology that the king himself had authorized. She demanded to know how she could be guilty of heresy for believing what England's official church now taught. The judges found themselves trapped. Anne's logic was flawless. When they accused her of rejecting Catholic teaching, she responded that Henry VIII had already done exactly that. When they claimed she lacked the authority to interpret scripture, she quoted the king's own proclamations that every English subject could read the Bible. Her most famous retort became legend among London's Protestants. When Judge Bonner accused her of prideful rebellion against church authority, Anne replied, "I marvel that you will judge me guilty of pride when I seek only to follow the same path our sovereign Lord the King has taken in matters of faith." The courtroom fell silent. She had just compared herself to Henry VIII in matters of religious authority. It was either a brilliant legal strategy or suicidal audacity. The judges had no choice but to release her. Legal technicalities and her connections to Queen Catherine's circle provided just enough protection. But Anne Askew had made powerful enemies who would not forget this humiliation. Her release only emboldened her, and returned to her pamphlet war with renewed fury. Her writings became more inflammatory, her distribution network more extensive. She attacked bishops by name, calling them wolves in sheep's clothing and enemies of God's truth. Common people throughout London began seeking out her texts, hungry for someone willing to challenge religious authority so boldly. The Catholic bishops watched this growing influence with mounting rage. Anne Askew had become more than a heretic. She had become a symbol of resistance that threatened their power. What Anne didn't realize was that her success had attracted the attention of men far more dangerous than local bishops. Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley had been watching her carefully, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. These weren't men interested in theological debates. They were political predators who saw in Anne Askew the key to destroying their ultimate target, Queen Catherine Parr herself. If they could prove Anne was connected to treasonous activities, they could implicate the Queen. If they could bring down Catherine Parr, they could restore Catholic power to Henry's court. Anne had become the centerpiece of a conspiracy she didn't even know existed. Every pamphlet she distributed, every theological argument she won, every convert she made to the Protestant cause only tightened the noose these men were preparing for her neck. The trap was set. All they needed was the right moment to spring it. The conspiracy against Anne was about to get deadly, and what happened next will shock you. But first, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Every subscription helps us bring these incredible untold stories to light. Don't let Anne's story be forgotten again. June 20th, 1546. Anne Askew was distributing pamphlets near St. Paul's Cathedral when armed guards surrounded her. This time, there would be no trial at Guildhall, no legal technicalities to exploit, no influential friends to intervene. The guards dragged her directly to the Tower of London. She knew immediately that everything had changed. The Tower wasn't a place for ordinary heresy trials. It was where traitors died. Her first interrogators were Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich, two of the most ruthless men in Henry's government. They weren't interested in her religious beliefs. They wanted names. Specifically, they wanted her to confess that Queen Catherine Parr had encouraged her heretical activities. Hour after hour they pressed her. Who had funded her pamphlets? Which court ladies had attended her illegal Bible studies? What treasonous conversations had occurred in the Queen's chambers? And refused to answer. She wouldn't implicate Catherine Parr. She wouldn't betray the Protestant women who had supported her cause. The interrogators grew desperate. Their entire conspiracy depended on Anne's testimony. Without her confession, they couldn't touch the Queen. Days passed, and remained silent. Then Henry VIII made a decision that would forever stain his reign. He issued a direct command that shocked even his own officials. Anne Askew was to be tortured until she confessed. This order violated centuries of English law. Women were legally exempt from judicial torture. The practice was reserved for male traitors and only in cases of national emergency. But Henry VIII was beyond caring about legal precedent. He wanted Queen Catherine Parr destroyed, and Anne Askew held the key. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley received the king's command with satisfaction. He would personally oversee Anne's torture, ensuring that every turn of the rack brought them closer to the Queen's downfall. The rack was a device designed to tear the human body apart slowly. The victim was bound by the wrists and ankles to a wooden frame. Levers controlled wheels that gradually pulled the limbs in opposite directions, stretching joints beyond their natural limits until they dislocated completely. And was already weakened from weeks of imprisonment when they dragged her into the torture chamber. She had been given minimal food, no exercise, and constant psychological pressure. Now they strapped her broken body to the instrument that would destroy what remained of her physical strength. Wriothesley began the questioning again. Who were her accomplices? What treasonous activities had she witnessed? Anne's response was the same silence that had frustrated them for weeks. The Lord Chancellor gave the signal. The wheels began to turn. Anne's shoulders stretched first. The guards could hear her joints cracking as they pulled beyond their sockets. Still, she refused to speak. Wriothesley ordered them to continue. Her hip joints dislocated next. The pain was beyond human comprehension, yet Anne Askew maintained her silence. Hours passed. Her body was being systematically destroyed, joint by joint, ligament by ligament. In a fury of frustration, Wriothesley threw off his robes and operated the rack himself. This was unprecedented. The Lord Chancellor of England personally tortured a woman, desperate to break her will. and spine began to separate. Her pelvis cracked. Her leg bones pulled free from their sockets with sounds that horrified even the experienced guards. Yet through all of this agony, she spoke only to pray aloud and declare her faith in God. When they finally stopped, Anne Askew was paralyzed from the waist down. Her bones were so shattered that she would never walk again. Her body was permanently crippled. But she had not implicated Queen Catherine Parr or any other Protestant reformer. They carried her back to her cell, a broken woman who had achieved something extraordinary. She had endured the worst torture the English legal system could inflict and emerged with her silence intact. Word of Anne's torture began to spread through London despite official attempts at secrecy. Messages were smuggled out of the Tower, describing in detail what the king's men had done to a woman whose only crime was refusing to betray her friends. Public outrage grew. Even Catholics were horrified by the torture of a woman. England had never seen such brutality directed at someone who posed no physical threat to the realm. But for Wriothesley and his conspirators, Anne's silence represented complete failure. They had destroyed her body and gained nothing. Queen Catherine Parr remained beyond their reach. Their plot had not only failed, it had exposed them as monsters willing to torture a helpless woman for political gain. Anne Askew lay in her cell, paralyzed and in constant agony, yet she had won the most important victory of her life. She had protected everyone she cared about while proving that no amount of physical suffering could break a truly determined spirit. July 15, 1546. Despite the torture revelations that had shocked London, the authorities proceeded with Anne Askew's heresy trial. They needed to legitimize what they had already decided. She would die for her beliefs. Guards carried Anne into the courtroom on a chair. Her legs hung uselessly, her spine twisted from the rack's destruction. Yet when the judges read the charges against her, Anne Askew responded with the same brilliant theological arguments that had made her famous. The charges were specific: denial of transubstantiation, rejection of priestly authority, and the claim that Scripture could be interpreted by individual believers without church guidance. These weren't just religious disagreements. In Henry VIII England, they constituted treason against the king's spiritual authority. Anne listened to each accusation with calm attention. When given the chance to defend herself, she spoke with clarity that amazed everyone present. Her body had been broken, but her mind remained razor-sharp. The judges demanded she explain her rejection of the Mass. Anne's response became one of the most quoted statements in Protestant history. "I would rather read 5 lines in the Bible than hear 5 Masses in the church." It was a declaration of war against everything the Catholic establishment represented. She was saying that direct access to Scripture held more value than all their elaborate rituals combined. For the assembled clergy, this was the ultimate blasphemy. The verdict was inevitable: death by burning, the standard punishment for heresy. Anne accepted the sentence with extraordinary composure. She had known this moment would come from the day she first challenged religious authority. But Anne Askew wasn't finished fighting. From her prison cell, she began writing her final testimony. Working in secret, often by candlelight, she documented her torture, her trial, and her unshakable faith. These writings were smuggled out of the Tower and would soon spread throughout Protestant Europe. She wrote letters to fellow reformers, urging them to continue the struggle regardless of what happened to her. She reminded them that truth couldn't be destroyed by fire, that ideas survived even when bodies were reduced to ash. Her preparation for death was methodical. She arranged for her writings to be preserved. She sent final messages to friends. She prepared her soul for what she knew would be an agonizing death. All of this while paralyzed, in constant pain, and facing the certainty of being burned alive. July 16, 1546. Smithfield Market, the execution site where England disposed of its religious enemies. A crowd of thousands gathered to witness something unprecedented: the burning of a woman so crippled she couldn't stand. Guards carried Anne to the stake on the same chair they had used in court. The crowd fell silent as they saw her condition. This wasn't the dramatic execution of a dangerous rebel. This was the systematic murder of a broken woman who posed no physical threat to anyone. Anne was tied to the stake while seated, her paralyzed legs unable to support her weight. Even her executioners seemed disturbed by the spectacle they were about to perform. The presiding bishop offered her one final chance to recant her beliefs and save her life. Anne's response carried clearly across the silent marketplace. "I came not hither to deny my Lord and Master." The wood was lit. As the flames began to rise around her chair, Anne Askew did something that witnesses remembered for the rest of their lives. She began to pray aloud, her voice clear and strong despite the approaching fire. The flames reached her legs first, but she felt nothing due to her paralysis. As the fire climbed higher, consuming her clothing and beginning to burn her flesh, Anne continued praying. Witnesses reported that she showed no signs of panic or despair. When the flames reached her torso, Anne's voice finally began to weaken, but she continued speaking words of faith until the smoke overcame her. She died as she had lived in those final months, refusing to surrender her beliefs regardless of the cost. The crowd dispersed in stunned silence. They had come expecting to see justice done against a dangerous heretic. Instead, they had witnessed the execution of a crippled woman whose only crime was reading the Bible and thinking for herself. The immediate impact was catastrophic for Henry VIII's reputation. Word spread rapidly through London and beyond. The king, who had once been seen as a religious reformer, was now viewed as a tyrant willing to torture and murder women for their beliefs. The conservative Catholic faction had achieved its goal of silencing Anne Askew, but at an enormous cost. Public opinion turned decisively against them. Their brutal methods had created a martyr whose influence would far exceed anything she had achieved while alive. Most importantly, Anne's writings spread throughout Protestant Europe faster than ever before. Her account of torture, her theological arguments, and her letters became powerful propaganda tools that inspired religious reformers across the continent. Anne Askew died believing her sacrifice would inspire others to stand for truth. Honor her memory by joining the Throne of Lies community. Subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. These stories of courage deserve to be told. Anne Askew's death created a legacy that her executioners never anticipated. She became the only woman in English history to be tortured in the Tower of London by direct royal command, a distinction that would haunt Henry VIII's reputation for centuries. More significantly, Anne was the first woman to leave a substantial written record of her own trial and torture. Her detailed accounts, smuggled from prison and preserved by Protestant networks, provided future generations with an unprecedented first-hand testimony of religious persecution. These writings became foundational texts in Protestant martyrology, inspiring countless others to resist tyranny. Her influence extended far beyond religious reform. Anne Askew became an early symbol of women's intellectual and spiritual independence, centuries before the formal feminist movement emerged. Her insistence that women could interpret scripture without male authority challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles in society. Religious freedom movements throughout Europe drew inspiration from her example. Her writings were translated into multiple languages, spreading the message that individual conscience could triumph over state oppression. Revolutionary thinkers in later centuries would cite Anne Askew as proof that ordinary people possessed the power to challenge even the most brutal governments. The parallels to our modern world are striking. Today, in countries across the globe, people still face persecution for their religious beliefs. Women continue fighting for the right to think independently and speak freely about matters of faith and conscience. Anne's story reminds us that the struggle between individual freedom and authoritarian control remains as relevant now as it was 500 years ago. Her willingness to sacrifice everything rather than betray her principles offers a timeless lesson about moral courage. In an era when many people compromise their beliefs for personal safety or social acceptance, Anne Askew demonstrated that some truths are worth defending regardless of the consequences. Most powerfully, her story illustrates how an individual conscience can challenge even the most powerful institutions. Anne was a woman with no political office, no army, no wealth. Yet her refusal to submit forced a king to reveal his brutality to the world. Her ideas survived while the system that destroyed her body eventually crumbled. Anne Askew's courage continues to inspire those who refuse to surrender their principles to tyranny. Her voice, silenced by flame and smoke, still speaks to anyone willing to stand for truth against overwhelming odds. Here at Throne of Lies, we believe these stories matter because they reveal the real cost of freedom. Every liberty we enjoy today was purchased with the blood of people like Anne Askew who chose death over surrender. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible accounts of human courage. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers and spread these vital stories to a new generation. Next time, we'll explore another royal monster whose cruelty shocked even medieval Europe. Anne Askew died believing that truth would ultimately triumph over tyranny. Her sacrifice reminds us that the greatest victories sometimes require the ultimate price. This is Throne of Lies, where we expose the truth behind history's darkest chapters.